Good afternoon. My name is Molly Coram, and I'm the Director of Class and University Programs for the Alumni Association here at WashU. On behalf of the Alumni Association, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our final Wednesdays with WashU this spring. We're excited to feature today's guest, Ann Brashares. During the conversation, please utilize the chat function to introduce yourself, share your affiliation with the university, where you're viewing this from. When you send a chat, please make sure you select panelists and all attendees. It's now my pleasure to introduce Danielle Dutton, who will be moderating today's conversation with Ann. Danielle's most recent book is the novel Margaret the First. She is an associate professor in the English Department Creative Writing MFA program at WashU and the co-founder and editor of the award-winning Literary Press Dorothy, a publishing project. Our featured speaker today is Ann Brashares, a WashU parent, New York Times bestselling author, and has won millions of fans with her blockbuster series, The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, in which she powerfully captures the emotional complexities of female friendship. As an undergraduate, Ann studied philosophy at Barnard College, expecting to continue her studies in graduate school. She took a year off college to work as an editor, hoping to save money for school. Loving her job, she never looked back, remaining in New York City and working in various editorial jobs until she began her first novel, The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, which became an international bestseller. Over the next 5 years, she wrote 3 sequels: The Second Summer of the Sisterhood, Girls in Pants, and Forever in Blue. Her first adult novel, The Last Summer of You and Me, was released in 2007. A companion book to the Sisterhood series, Three Willows, The Sisterhood Grows, was published in 2009. The second companion book, Sisterhood Everlasting, was published in 2011. Her second novel for adults, My Name is Memory, was published in 2010 and has been optioned for film. Brashares' young adult time travel novel, The Here and Now, was published in 2014, and The Whole Thing Together was published in 2017. Ann is a mother of 4 and lives in New York City. She's married to artist Jacob Collins and grew up in and around Washington, D.C. Before becoming a writer, she was a student of philosophy, a receptionist, an editor, a ghostwriter, and briefly, the co-president of a small media company. Danielle, Ann, welcome.
Thank you, Molly. Hi, Ann. It's nice to see you. Thank you so much for being here with us. So as was just mentioned, I'm a professor in the English department here at WashU, and I teach undergraduate and graduate fiction writing workshops. Some of my students are no doubt watching this virtually right now. So as they are thinking about their careers, I wonder if you could share with us how you first became interested in writing, and then what are some of the things that led to you ultimately pursuing writing professionally?
Let's see. I have always loved stories and storytelling and gravitated towards stories of all kinds. And I feel like the older I get, the more kind of I appreciate like the exquisite way our brains work in terms of learning and thinking and understanding the world in stories, which is kind of a beautiful thing, and in a way is sort of, the most sort of triumphant thing about sort of human history is our ability to share stories and develop culture and understanding. And then it also leads to all kinds of, biases and distortions and things like that. But I remember even as like a little kid, my second grade teacher, I think, had a beautiful storytelling voice. And she would, sit down on the rug and say, "Once upon a time." And like my body would just go still and my mind would light up. And it was just my favorite part of the day. I'd be like lying on her by the time she finished the story. So I guess I just was a reader. I made up stories all the time. I wasn't a writer until I got to be much later in my life. I didn't think of being a writer or consider myself a writer. But I remember when I started my first book, which was The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, I decided in a sort of corny way to start with the phrase, "Once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a pair of pants," because I just wanted that sort of clarion call, this is a story is starting here.
Yeah, that just makes me want to ask, like, if you've loved fairy tales when you were a kid in particular, or can you remember the books that you were most in love with when you were little, things you read over and over and over?
I did read fairy tales, and I did read, let's see, I I loved some fantasy, but for some reason I didn't have a lot of it. My librarian didn't direct me to it so much. I read a lot of more sort of realistic fiction. I remember there was this tiny little book I read in second grade, and there's something that people say, and I sort of share this, that there's almost like one book in every person's life that turns them into a reader. And for me, wasn't until second grade, and it was a book called Dreams of Victory. I'm trying to think who the writer was. And I thought it was like this big, thick tome of a book. It was probably like, 82 pages. And it was about a girl who had a very, very vivid imagination and love of storytelling. And she was not very popular, and she didn't have that many friends, and she was highly underconfident. But in her mind, she lived this great, rich life. And at the end, she realizes that she's not good at sports, and she's not good at drama class, and she's not good at art class, and she's not good at whatever, but she's going to be a writer when she grows up. So of course, this book stands out to me in a number of different ways. But I remember that was the book that turned me into a reader, if nothing else. Yeah. And then after that, I loved, the Little House books, the Anne of Green Gables books. I guess I liked a lot of historical fiction. I love Judy Blume, who I've gotten to meet in my life as a writer, which has been amazing. But all kinds of different things. And again, probably with a little bit of an inclination toward more realistic fiction.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We have very similar childhood reading habits, I think. Okay, so Molly mentioned before that you graduated from Barnard after studying philosophy there, which is very interesting to me, interesting choice. And I'm just curious if you could talk about how your studies and like a liberal arts education has been important to your writing or your career. Is that something that you can articulate or track at all?
I don't know if I can. I mean, it's so easy to connect the dots backward, and so hard to sort of project any of it forward. So with the view of, the wisdom of hindsight in history and all that, I guess I would say that I think certainly philosophy taught me how to be or I like to think it taught me how to be a kind of a rigorous reader and thinker and writer. And I also, I love logic, I love reasoned argument, and I love sort of structure and rhetoric, which are pretty dry in a certain way, particularly, well, to me, they weren't really. But I feel like in terms of structuring a story, building a story, these are really useful building blocks. So I would say that that sort of love of reason and love of logic has sort of stayed with me always. And I also think like that I really sort of paid my dues in some ways as far as like frustration and even boredom. And I have this idea that like boredom is one of the secret ingredients to storytelling, and that in a way you want to kind of start from zero and learn how to build in a kind of a patient way. My 11-year-old son was saying to me last night at dinner, he said, the thing about Marvel movies recently, he's become a critic, is that they start at 10 out of 10. And where do you go from there? And so I've had this feeling of like, no, you can't do that. Like proper storytelling, you need, all the different, sort of speeds.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I love what your child said. I talk about boredom with my students quite a lot, actually. And the idea of starting small, like how do you get from the small to the big inside of just a short story space? Okay.
And that's exactly right. Like one of the things I feel like in addition to structure and hierarchy, it's like how you fit the big things with the little things, I think is something in philosophy that you spend some time on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have to admit, philosophy was my worst class as an undergrad. It was the only class I didn't get a good grade in, and I thought, I hate philosophy now, but maybe I was just too young when I...
If you came back to it, you might feel differently.
I might, yeah. Okay, so this is a sort of a related question, actually. Still thinking about what we learn in college, but in arts and sciences here, we talk a lot about how the various disciplines converge and intersect, and how those intersections strengthen our students' career opportunities and their imaginations and their abilities to be engaged, citizens in the world. So can you talk about at all like interdisciplinary connections in your life or in your career that have been meaningful to you?
I would say, they certainly have been. I'm thinking back to my happiest year in high school, and I was studying Euclidean geometry and math, and that was the only math I ever had any gift for. And in, literally literature. We were reading ancient Greek drama and studying, ancient sculpture and architecture in my art history class. And I had a philosophy class. That's actually what caused me to fall in love with philosophy. I was reading Plato, which is just never fails to amaze. And I just remember just my head exploding with all of the sort of interdisciplinary joy of that experience. And then going forward in college, I mean, my favorite sort of course of study was really like intellectual history, art and literature and history. And, and to this day, I love to read history. I love to talk about history. Everyone in my family seems to share that love. So that's been really, really fun. And, in books that I've written, I've really been able to sort of make use of that love and that background. And one book in particular that I've been working on recently, a lot of it takes place in 18th century France. And so getting to do that research has been a lot of fun. But I guess I just think that the ability to make connections between people and times and places and ideas is such a natural joy. And it also, I think, encourages sympathy and perspective in this sort of broad scale, and also humility and understanding like the complexity of even seemingly simple things.
Oh my gosh, so many questions coming off of that. First, when you said intellectual history was your favorite thing to study, I was a history major as an undergrad, and it wasn't until I studied medieval European history, and it wasn't until I got to the end of my senior year that I realized I should have done intellectual history. I realized, like, this is what I love, this web of like art and literature and politics together, and I was like, darn it, wish I could do
I had
it
the very same insight when I graduated. It's like, now I'm ready to start again. Now I know what I want to do.
Yeah, it was literally like 4 or 5 weeks before the end of my senior year that I thought, oh, I wish I could do it all over again.
Yeah.
But then I did just keep going to school. So you can stay in school forever, I guess, if you want. Oh, and that made me forget the other thing. Oh, just listening to you, makes me think, I'm sort of thinking, you have college-aged kids and younger, and it just makes me think about, sort of how you talk to your kids about like what they're going to study at college. Are you just sort of like one of those whatever, follow your fantasy kind of parents?
I guess I would say I am. I mean, my husband is a painter. He's an artist. I'm a writer. Our kids, it's hard for me to say, you've got to make practical choices in your life because I did make some practical choices, but a lot of choices I've made haven't been practical. They've really just been following whatever my natural inclination and love is. So it would be hard for me to say to any of my kids, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. We're a very impractical bunch, but have good conversations.
Yeah, I bet you do. I love a family that likes to talk about history together. Okay, so just changing gears a little bit, could you describe your process as a writer? In practical terms even, do you have a strict routine? And I'm curious, has your process changed over the years?
I do not have a strict routine, and I very, very much sometimes wish I did. I tend to be either on the inside of a book, in which case I'm sort of living in that imagined world and I just want to spend my time there. And the outside world feels a little jarring and kind of like, when can I get back into my place? So when I'm on the inside of a book, I'm wanting to work and write all the time. And then that's not really sustainable in a long-term way, particularly with the household and kids and everything. So once I'm on the outside of a book, I can't figure out how to get back in. And I waste a lot of time. I procrastinate. I have a lot of trouble moving from the not inside a book to the inside of a book, getting to know new characters, in inventing new characters in a new world and feeling like you want to make them, that they become interesting enough that you want to really spend time with them, spend time there. So I would say I think Anthony Trollope most famously, finished one novel and he had his writing hours in the morning from, 7 to 11 or whatever. And if he finished an entire 1,000-page novel, at 9:30 in the morning, he would, start his next one. He'd get out another sheet of paper and start the next novel. He was so disciplined about it. So that is pretty much the opposite of me in every possible way. And I would say that it's important in an early part of a book to give yourself time to create your world, to get to know it. It's like when you go to a party and you don't know anyone and you don't want to spend time with them. Like, particularly if you're a bit shy, which I am, and maybe a little bit introverted, it's hard to spend time with people you don't know yet, but you will get to know them if you keep at it. And I would say in an early part of a book, I try and give myself, several hours at a time to work. And then once I'm, as I said, on the inside, I can write, running to the bus stop practically. Anytime I can sit down and, write anywhere on anything, I will write.
Yeah, I actually completely relate to everything you're saying. So when you're talking about those hours, give yourself hours to get into something when it's new. Do you turn off Wi-Fi? Do you have ways you remove yourself, as a mom? Like, what do you do to give yourself all those hours when it's early days?
Yeah. When the kids were young, I would try and work at night after they were in bed because I felt like that was the only time I could sort of slip my ties here and kind of go off into my imagination and not worry about anything else. As they've gotten older, I would say I do work more, during the day. I still work at night sometimes. What I've done typically is the first half of every one of my books I've probably written in a library because that way I can, again, sort of cut myself off a little bit from regular day-to-day stuff. And also, I can't go to the refrigerator as actively and often as I tend to like to do. And I can't, I have to turn my phone off. Wi-Fi, I never learn the Wi-Fi password at the library so that I'll never be tempted. So again, that's how I sort of, restrict all other input and make that hard process of getting inside. And then again, once I do that, I can write the second half of my book anywhere.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love the library idea. Yay, libraries. Okay, so you have 4 children, I believe, and your daughter, Susanna, has just completed her second year at WashU. Is that right?
Right. Yep.
Okay. Congratulations to her. So I'm curious, did your kids provide any inspiration while you were writing your super acclaimed New York Times bestselling The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants books? Or I'm curious too, as they've grown, if they've changed you as a writer in ways you can articulate.
Right. I feel like, so Susanna in particular, she is my one girl. I have 3 sons. And I was pregnant with her when I wrote that first book. And I remember when she was a tiny baby, the process of, trying to become a writer and dragging her on so many book tours, usually with my mom or my dad and, to help out. And oh my gosh, the number of bookstores she's been to. And it's funny because, I have 3 brothers. She was the first girl born in the family in decades on both sides. And so I think there's some sense in which like this wonderful sort of, girl novel, it's, I wrote in, with her, gestating her at the same time. I remember her 4th birthday happened the night of the premiere of the movie, the first Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants movie. And I remember she wore a tiara and ate a cupcake at the premiere. And I remember, Blake Lively hugging her and all the actors like hugging her and making a fuss. And she was sort of like, who are these people? They're not my mom. They're not my aunt. But everybody was very sweet to her. So I feel like her life has sort of gone along. Yeah. The kids have all, been dragged to different bookstores and book tours and things like that. They were really a bit young when I was writing to directly inspire what I was writing. But I would say, I certainly credit them with the sort of ambient atmosphere of, buoyancy, love, humor. And I have definitely, as they've gotten to be teenagers and even beyond, started to kind of tune in more to ways they think and ways they talk. And of course, having them read my books is yet another thing. But yeah, they're very much along for this ride.
That's so sweet. That story that your daughter Susanna's sort of grown up with the book, kind of like right alongside each other.
Yeah.
My son is 13, and when he does read my work, he does give me like feedback. Mm-hmm. He lets me know, what he thinks is good and what's not good. So has she had like herself a relationship to those books that she's talked about with you? Not to put Susanna on the spot, but I'm just curious.
Susanna, if you're watching.
Yeah.
I would say she's such a sort of loving and uncritical reader, which I think I just have to be grateful for that. So, I mean, I think her criticisms would certainly be thoughtful and wise because that's how she is. And I'm trying to think again. She read those books because she was too young for them when they were coming out. But I think she has sort of a feeling for them, having
Lived with them.
watched me develop those characters and all the different, and even me sort of interacting with readers at bookstores and things like that. I think that's all kind of
Listening to your Q&A with fans, I bet it's been
Mhm.
interesting. Yeah, that's really cute. Okay, so you just mentioned the movies, and I'm just super curious what it was like for you to have your books turned into movies, and wondered if you could talk just a little about that, like seeing your novel turned into a screenplay and then into an actual film out in the world, like completely away from you. I mean, your book is already away from you, but I wonder if the movie is like even a further remove in a strange way,
Yeah.
and how that affected your relationship to the series or subsequent writing, if it did at all.
Right. No, it definitely did. That's a good way of putting it. It sort of gets outside you and then it gets more outside you. So, writing is such, of course, as you know, such a kind of a private and intimate thing. And it's kind of, your brain interacting with your pen or your keyboard or however you write. It's so sort of private and quiet and solitary. And then to kind of watch, I remember being on set, particularly for the first movie a bunch of times, or not a bunch of times, maybe 3 times. And, watching, all the kind of logistics and the gears that needed to turn to be able to put this whole thing together, and where it was just me by myself, with my computer, it became like a cast of hundreds of people doing all kinds of different things, and each of them bringing their own, ideas and their own art to it much of the time. So it's so collaborative compared to writing. And writing a book is so much easier than making a movie for a lot of different reasons. I mean, not that writing a book can't feel very, very hard, but for a simple thing of like, I would write, I remember, I'd write a line, the rain was coming down, and then being on set and watching the incredible efforts to get rain coming down, the machines and the wind machine and the, getting the light right. And it took so much time and so many takes. And I was like, all I had to do was write a few words. Yeah. So that's a lot easier. But I would say that the first movie came out after I'd written the 3rd book, which is called Girls in Pants, and before I wrote the 4th of the original 4 books. And I remember even bringing the galley of the 3rd book on the set. And I remember America Ferrera, who played Carmen, is a very avid reader, and she grabbed it and she was reading it between takes, and then the book came out, and then the movie came out, and then I was, had the experience of watching it and sort of interacting with it, appreciating the work of the director and the actors. I think they did a wonderful job, and kind of, the sort of visual reality of it, that was the story. And then, so starting writing that 4th book, I resisted it. I resist starting things, as I've said, but I resisted that terribly, feeling like, is that going to be superimposed on the world that I kind of created and imagined? Like, is this version now going to be my version? And am I going to, again, regain that very direct relationship I had to those characters? And for the first couple days, it did. But then once I settled down, once I spent my many hours at the library, sitting in my chair, that fell away. And I realized that there is sort of a creative firewall in a way between the movie version, which is sort of analogous, but it's really the work of a lot of other people, and the books, which are mine for better and worse. But I definitely reconnected with my old version of the characters and of their world.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was thinking as you're talking how when I was very young, I loved Jane Austen's novels, and I think I'd read all of them before I ever saw an adaptation film. But then when I will go back to reread a Jane Austen novel, it's very hard for me not to see those actors in my mind as the characters now, which really frustrates me. And so, yeah, but it's great to hear that you were able, I mean, writing is different from reading. So it's great to hear that when you sat in your own writing space, you were able to let that go.
It did take a little bit of work. And it, again, caused a lot of fear and uncertainty about how I would relate. But I know what you mean about that. For books that I love most, I almost can't bring myself to watch the adaptation because, again, I want to kind of hold on to my version of it.
Yeah, I know. And this is something I talk about with my son a lot because, you know, a lot of great kids books get turned into movies and he's either thrilled or super upset with the adaptation. And it's fun. It is fun to talk about. He likes to talk about stories a lot too. Okay, so you've written 10 books, I think. Is that right?
I think so.
I think so. So that's a lot of books.
To count them, but yeah, a lot of books.
Yeah, I won't name them all because Molly did that at the beginning.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about what you're working on now, your 11th book, I guess. And then I do have a follow-up question if we have time for it.
Okay. This will be kind of short. I wrote a book called My Name is Memory, and it kind of didn't end in the way that it needed to end. I had always planned to write a sequel and had gotten very delayed in doing so for a bunch of almost publishing reasons, logistical reasons, whatever. So I didn't get to finish the story. So I've had this sense of like, I somehow owe a debt to anyone who's ever read that book, who liked it and cared about it. And they're a kind of a hardcore few who do and have. So almost just for them, it's not a great number. I wanted to write a sequel. So I did that over the last year. And did a lot of fun historical research for it. And that project is actually now in development at Lionsgate for a TV series. And so I partly wanted to kind of keep thinking about that world in case it goes to the next stage, which, you know, fingers crossed that it will. Yeah. So that book hasn't been launched in book form yet, but the manuscript is mostly done. And so that's one thing. And then I'm starting a new book, which I haven't started something truly new in a while. And so that's the plan for the summer. And I'm just in those very kind of early, fragile stages.
Yeah, don't talk about it then. I hate when I find myself talking about something before I really start working on it. And I just hear myself saying, stop talking, because it kind of like messes me up afterwards. Yeah,
I know. I remember some writer saying to me once, like, don't talk away your book. And that sounded terrible, but you do need to kind of conserve your energy. And also you don't want to have to hold yourself to anything. And almost just the act of letting it go into the air in words, you almost feel like, well, you know, you're beholden to some aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So my follow-up was actually just, I'm curious, since you've written such a range of books for different audiences, if you find it different to work on like a YA or children's book versus writing fiction for adults.
I don't feel categorical about that at all. And I feel like actually a lot of my books are pretty similar in the sense that I tend to love to write about kind of that young adult sort of first, you know, that sort of level of consciousness and newness and excitement about love and about, you know, family relationships and friendships. And so I don't stray all that far. I wish I could say that I did in some ways, but usually, again, I don't think, okay, well, now I'm writing an adult book, so it's going to be like this. I think it's more that if I'm writing about a 23-year-old, I try to really inhabit the mind, the thoughts, the feelings of that character. And if I'm going to try and inhabit the mind of a 16-year-old, that's a somewhat different process because she's a different character and at a different place on life's ladder. So that's sort of difference, I'd say.
So it's like you just have to write the book and then you can let the publishing world worry about
Exactly.
what it's supposed to be, how they're going to sell it. Okay, so this will be my last question actually, and then we'll switch over to the pre-submitted questions from audience members.
Okay.
So this is a really broad question, but what's the best piece of career advice or life advice that you've been given that you'd want to share with any students who are watching today?
Okay, I would say, I think that sometimes for me, and particularly when I was just first writing my first book, I think it's hard to take your work seriously, particularly when it doesn't quite exist yet. And you don't, I mean, it's taken me decades to try and call myself a writer when you somehow don't feel like you have any idea what you're doing. So I guess I would say that in almost every project, and I'd be interested to hear how you feel about this. I've talked to some other writers who've shared similar experiences. It feels like there's almost like this middle place that happens in the writing of a book or a story where your initial sort of excitement and impetus maybe can sort of run out a little bit. And you're sort of faced with the big questions of like, what's the point of this? And does it matter? And, do I believe in this? And, in the sort of the why and what for and who cares questions come in. And I think that that's an important moment to kind of, tie yourself to the mast, Odysseus style, and not try to answer the big questions. In fact, it's better if you ignore them and just keep going and just keep going and just keep writing and get past that sort of loss of certainty or excitement or faith in it to keep going. So I remember with my first book, the thing I'm proudest of all of things that I've done in my career so far, the one thing that I come back to as being a source of pride to me is that with that first book, I hit that middle place hard. And I just felt so consumed by uncertainty and judgment of it. And I remember I lost the thread, I lost faith in it. And even I just thought, okay, even if this absolutely stinks, I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to finish it. And that's how I became a writer. So I would say to commit to what you're doing, and when those middle doubts come or wherever they come in your process, to just keep working to get to the end. And the other thing I would say is that, writers sort of wait around, and I do this too, sort of for the muse to come. I'll go hiking on a beautiful mountain and the muse will come. Yeah. I'll make this beautiful dinner and the muse will come. Well, typically, at least in my experience, the muse comes when you've been sitting at your desk in the library for hours and days at a time.
Yeah.
It's by working that the ideas seem to come.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that what you're talking about makes me think about is how I have to force my students to do revisions. But I do force them. If any of them are watching right now, they'll know, because
you got to do it.
You got to do it, because I'm always saying, like, that love affair, that, like, you're talking about, that excitement period will pass, and you've got to be willing to keep working on it after that, and just trust that, you had all that excitement for a reason, and now you have to do the hard work of writing this story or this book, whatever it is. Okay, that was great. Thank you. So let's see. From the questions from our audience, number 1, what are the best resources for someone looking to understand how to structure and write their first novel?
Let's see, there's so many great books about writing. One, standout, famous, great one is Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, which I actually don't think is great on structure, but it's truly great on a lot of things. I remember reading a book on writing by Stephen King, which I was surprised to really, I think he's, a fantastic writer in a lot of ways, and he can tell a story. I know I actually remember when I was an editorial assistant long, long ago, my boss sent me and a few other assistants to this weekend story structure seminar by this kind of Hollywood screenwriting guru named Bob McKee. And I think pretty much all the other assistants left after like the 5th hour, but I just sort of stuck with it because I was pretty interested in it. I guess I was pretty interested in story structure from the get-go. And so I stayed for the whole many million hours, the 40 hours, it was a long weekend. And there were things about it that I was sort of a little bit, mocking of or dismissive of, which I sort of regret, but I was whatever. It was, for all the sort of literary pretensions that people had who were, being editorial assistants, it was sort of a little bit anathema to that because it was a bit formulaic. But the truth was I learned so much from it about just the building blocks of story, how stories are built out of scenes and, the beginning and the middle and the end. And it just, there was nothing about it that I could dismiss. I've thought about it so many times since. So I don't know if Robert McKee is still giving his story structure seminar over a weekend, but I learned so much from it. And I guess I would also say about structuring stories, and this is not all that helpful, but just to read and read and read. And I know you know this so well as a writer and a teacher, like read as a writer, try not to only read as a reader. Don't be I mean, as much as I love just the passive joy of reading, I think to be more active, to read as a writer, to read for, sort of analytical, sort of structural issues, like what about this is working? How is it working? Why is it working? And what can I learn from it?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Okay, second question. Did you need a literary agent to get your first book published?
I did not have an agent when I got my first book published. I think agents are very helpful. They're not essential. They're probably, agents and editors before, now with like online writing communities, self-publishing options, fan fiction, even like it's such a big, wide, wild world, which is great. So I think the agents and editors as kind of the gatekeepers, as they were probably 15, 20, 25 years ago, they're not that anymore, but they can still be very, very useful. I didn't have an agent, but I had been working sort of peripherally, marginally in publishing. And so there were some people that I knew. And particularly there was an editor who'd read a bunch of like big rewriting jobs I'd done. And she was somebody who was very supportive and even like persistent, insistent about like, you have to give this a shot. So I definitely had a lot of support from somebody who knew the business well. And then after I published my first book, I did get an agent who was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So now you need an agent.
Well, I think it's very useful. It's not essential, but it's really useful.
No, I definitely agree. Because agents handle all kinds of embarrassing, awkward stuff that then you don't have to handle yourself too.
Yes, it's true. And it's nice to have somebody advocate on your behalf. Yeah. Sometimes self-advocacy is hard, or demanding things is hard. I wouldn't think to demand the things she demanded. And after I found out about them, I thought, why did you demand that? That's crazy. But again, somebody to advocate for you and just leave you to your writing, that's a gift.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, this is interesting. So 21 years later, how would you retell the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants for our world today? Would you change anything if you were starting now, do you think? Or
I think I probably would. I mean, I think I thought somewhat about sort of like diversity from a kind of a cultural and a personal point of view, kind of almost in a bunch of different ways. But I think I would think about that more deeply. I would. I don't, I don't want to assume anything or take anything for granted. I think our world, I feel like my eyes have opened up to that more, and hopefully better, about trying to represent like more people from different backgrounds. So, or just in all kinds of ways. So I guess that's something that I would want to think about more deeply. And also just technology really has changed our day-to-day lives in the last 20 years. And I see that with my kids profoundly. So yeah. I couldn't ignore that.
Yeah.
It's too important, and it does play a role in people's psychological and emotional lives, sometimes so much that I wish it didn't.
Yeah, especially teenage girls.
Yeah. But you can't get around it, and I couldn't if I were writing it now.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, a related question was, which character did you identify most with in Sisterhood?
I would identify, this is such lame writer answer, but whoever I was writing, because I wrote the girls separately. I'd write one character at a time, and then I'd kind of put them together and write the scenes in which they were together sort of afterward, once I really felt like I knew who they were. Mm-hmm. I hate writing group scenes when I feel like I don't know who they are or whose point of view I'm really writing. So I waited for the end until I felt strong in that. So whoever I was writing was the one I loved the most. And then having to finish up her scenes and then transition to a new character was really hard. And I resisted it, as I resist things. And then I would fall in love with her, and she was my absolute favorite and my heart's delight. And then this process would go again. But I guess I would say, taking a few steps back and many years past, I would say that temperamentally, I'm probably a Tibby Lena mix, maybe, but I gave more biography to Carmen.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. I'm getting distracted by this idea of like how you would change a book 21 years later. It's like, that's a really big, hard question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay. Someone says they are a fellow WashU Virginian. I am overwhelmed by the task of developmentally editing my first young adult novel. Any general advice for what to leave in versus what to leave out? Editing is hard. It's fun.
Editing is hard. It really is. Revising is hard. That's a good and interesting question. I had this experience not long ago where I was reading a book I'd written many years before. And the parts of the book that I really enjoyed and liked, I was telling my daughter this the other day. The parts that I really liked were the parts that I felt like somebody else had written. And the parts that I didn't like nearly as well are where I saw my own sort of fingerprints all over it. And what I started to realize thinking about that is that the parts that I didn't like as much were kind of like, sort of pacing and sort of more the sort of scaffolding structural parts, the sort of the setup more or less, where I could sort of feel the gears turning. It was more forceful, more effortful in a way that's not that pleasant when you're writing it, not that pleasant when you're reading it. But sometimes you need the scaffolding to sort of launch you into the part where you're immersed and the characters feel like they're speaking for themselves. And you sort of just, you're there and you see it and you feel it. And there's that, they call it like a flow state where you disappear into your work. And that's joy. I mean, that's wonderful. So, and those are the parts that I read over later, even years later. And I don't remember writing it. I feel like somebody else did. So I guess I would say the parts that you want to be suspicious of are the parts where you're doing a lot of setting up. And actually, in a very practical way, when I'm editing a mostly finished manuscript, there's this exercise that I do, and maybe this is like a common thing, but I will go back and I will delete the first paragraph of every scene in the entire book, because I realize that the setup is often that first paragraph and your reader doesn't really need it. Or you're sort of like, as a writer, kind of clearing your throat and getting in. And the reader doesn't need to read that. So I guess I would say the sort of the scaffolding, the setup, that first throat clearing paragraph of your scene, those are the things as an editor I would be suspicious of and be ready to take out.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's great advice. Thanks. What is your favorite publishing memory?
This is more of a writing memory, I guess. I remember when I finished my first book and didn't have any readers yet. I don't even know if I'd sent it to my editor yet, but I gave it to my husband to read. And I was very nervous and very insecure about it. And I remember handing him, the pile of pages that made up the manuscript. And, and he was reading it in our bedroom. And I remember like a couple hours later, like sort of tiptoeing past, and I heard him laugh. And then he laughed again. And I was just kind of amazed. And I remember, like kind of hiding out at the top of the stairs, out of sight, so he didn't see me there, but just listening. And each time he laughed, that kind of, magnificent feeling of being able to entertain someone with your words and sentences. And particularly to entertain somebody who you love. So that's more of a writing story. But I remember kind of a not similar thing, which was the first time seeing a stranger reading my book in an airport. A lovely girl who I then accosted and probably scared her and her mother to death, because I'd never seen that before and it was exciting. But I just that feeling of, wow, like I as a writer, this book is being read by a stranger and we're sharing this connection of an imagined world and having feelings about characters that now exist for both of us, and sort of sharing this imaginary space and with people that I'll never really know or meet, but feeling connected. And that was a very powerful feeling.
Yeah, that's nice. Whenever my husband reads my work and laughs, I cannot restrain myself from saying, like, "What's funny? What are you laughing
what? Read it
I
to
need
me.
to
What
know."
sentence was it?
Exactly what.
Oh, that feeling.
Okay, how did you come up with the idea for your first book?
I have kind of a long history of clothes sharing adventures and this sort of kind of superstitious feeling that clothes can kind of hold your feelings, your memories, your experiences. I feel that for my kids too. And I have a great wedding dress sharing story, which is, this is the time for it. But so that's a bit in the background. I had been wanting to write a sort of multiple point of view, multiple protagonist sort of structured book about friends and friendship, and had been sort of thinking about it, trying it different ways. And a friend and coworker mentioned a pair of jeans that she'd shared with some friends, and that was kind of the spark. And then it kind of went from there.
There were some magical jeans then.
There sort of were. I mean, I don't know if they really considered them to be magical exactly, but there was a sense of, and again, I've had this with friends too, of community around it, around like, a concrete object that can stand for a huge load of impressions and feelings.
It's very sweet. Okay, here is our last question, and actually it's just perfect timing. What pushed you from all your prior jobs to successfully committing to being a writer?
It happened sort of gradually, because I had been working in editorial and helping revise, in some cases outline, edit, like sort of behind the scenes kind of work for 12 years, honestly. It wasn't like a quick thing. And for probably 11 of those 12, I didn't even have the idea of becoming a writer. I mean, I loved stories and storytelling and all of the kind of craft and art of it, but I didn't really think like, I'm a writer, I want to be a writer, I need to be a writer. But I guess I had started to really store up a lot of ideas about, well, if this were my book, if I were writing a book, having a lot of thoughts about it, which is how I made the transition, I guess, from being an editor to being a writer. But it did feel long, and it did feel sort of gradual. There wasn't, the moment of commitment is sort of as I described, which was the sort of period of darkness and doubts in the middle of that first book, where I actually managed to make myself finish it, even when I just didn't see it and didn't want to. Yeah. So that, I guess, that's the moment where I felt like I committed to the idea of being a writer, of actually writing and completing something.
Were you still working at your editorial job as you started writing the first book?
Well, I had taken a leave of absence. I was pregnant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was sort of getting to the point where I was going to take a maternity leave, and I didn't quit my job, and I really needed to hold on to my health insurance, which is probably why I didn't quit my job. So I took a leave of absence for about 4 months to write it.
Wow. And did you write it in 4 months?
Yes, I did.
Very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm either on the inside or the outside. When I'm on the inside, I work a lot.
You weren't kidding.
On the outside, I waste a lot of time.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much, Ann, for being here with us today. And on behalf of the WashU Alumni Association, I want to thank all of you out there for joining us, and just wish everybody a really happy and safe evening wherever you are. Thanks for being here.
Danielle, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone.